Imagine you are signing a contract. You read it carefully, you understand it, you agree to the terms, and then you discover that several additional agreements, unrelated to what you thought you were signing, had been added to the document before it reached your desk. Most people would consider that unfair. Most people would say, I should have had the chance to consider each agreement on its own terms, with its own debate, before I signed anything. That is exactly what happens in Congress, regularly, and last week it happened on national television, in a vote that this channel covered in real time. On July 22, 2026, the House of Representatives voted on H.R. 8800, the FY 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, a $115 trillion must-pass defense bill. Inside that bill, a provision creating a permanent Pentagon executive agent authority to integrate a foreign ally's defense industrial sector into U.S. military programs of record across AI, cyber, missile defense, quantum computing, and biotechnology. A bipartisan pair of House members, one Republican, one Democrat, introduced an amendment to give that specific provision its own vote. The House Rules Committee blocked it. No standalone vote was permitted. The only vote available was on the entire $1.15 trillion bill. Tonight on Words with Wentz, I am going to make a case I believe in as a paralegal and as an American citizen. Every major provision that affects the lives of millions of Americans deserves its own debate and its own vote. I am going to present the counterargument fairly, because it exists and it deserves to be heard. And then I am going to tell you what 44 states have already figured out that Congress has not. The United States Constitution gives Congress the power to make laws. Article 1 is clear on that. What Article I does not say is how those laws must be structured, how many subjects a single bill may address, or whether unrelated provisions may be combined in a single vote. Over time, Congress developed a practice that the Constitution does not prohibit, but that the founders could not fully have anticipated: the Omnibus bill. An omnibus bill is legislation that combines multiple, sometimes unrelated subjects into a single vote. Omnibus appropriations bills, which fund the entire federal government in one massive package, have become one of the primary mechanisms by which Congress operates. The annual defense authorization bill, the continuing resolutions that fund the government when regular appropriations fail, the major legislative packages that combine tax policy with healthcare with foreign aid. These are omnibus vehicles. Inside those vehicles ride what are called legislative riders, provisions attached to must-pass legislation that could not necessarily survive a standalone vote. A rider on a must-pass appropriations bill has an enormous structural advantage. Oppose it and you oppose the bill it is attached to. For a member of Congress whose district needs the funding that bill provides, that is not a real choice. The Congressional Research Service has documented this pattern extensively. Riders have been used to advance policy on immigration, environmental regulation, financial oversight, foreign policy, and defense procurement. Often with limited debate, often without committee hearings on the specific provision, and often without a standalone vote that would allow members to express their actual position on the issue itself. The practice is not new. It is not exclusively partisan. Both parties have used it when they held the majority, and it has accelerated. The bills have gotten longer, the riders have gotten more significant, and the ability of any individual member of Congress or any individual voter to hold anyone accountable for any specific provision has gotten harder. I said I would present the counter-argument fairly, and I meant it, because the case for omnibus legislation is not frivolous. It reflects real constraints that Congress operates under. Congress faces genuine deadlines. The government must be funded. The military must be authorized. Treaties must be ratified. When negotiations break down, when a divided Congress cannot reach agreement on individual spending bills, an omnibus package is sometimes the only vehicle that can move. The alternative, a government shutdown, a military without authorization, a debt ceiling crisis, has its own documented costs. Compromise is also genuinely easier in an omnibus framework. When Member A needs funding for a project in their district, and Member B needs a policy provision in their bill, combining those needs in a single vehicle enables both to happen. Separately, both might fail. Together, they move. That is not corruption. It is the kind of coalition building that Madison described in Federalist No. 51 as the necessary friction of a representative government with separated powers. Some provisions that are genuinely good policy would never survive a standalone vote because they are politically costly. A member of Congress who might vote for a reasonable regulatory change in the context of a broader package might not be willing to cast a standalone vote for it, because that vote can be isolated and used against them in the next election. The omnibus vehicle provides political cover for difficult but necessary decisions. These are real arguments. They are made by serious people who have studied how Congress works, and I want to acknowledge them directly, because dismissing them would be intellectually dishonest. But acknowledging them does not resolve the fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem is this: when must-pass legislation becomes the primary vehicle for provisions that cannot survive on their own merits, the voter's ability to hold anyone accountable for anything specific effectively disappears. A vote for or against a $115 trillion bill is not a vote for or against any specific provision in that bill. It is not accountability. It is not representation. It is a forced choice between the whole package and nothing. Here is the argument that I find most persuasive, and it does not come from a think tank or a reform organization. It comes from the documented practice of 44 American state legislatures. The National Conference of State Legislatures documents that approximately 44 states have some form of single-subject constitutional requirement for their legislation. The specific language and enforcement mechanisms vary, but the core principle is consistent. A bill should address one subject. Provisions on unrelated topics should not be combined into a single vote that forces members to take or leave an entire package. And here is what the record shows about those 44 state legislatures. They still function. They still pass budgets. They still reach compromises. They still enact complex legislation on difficult issues. The single subject requirement does not paralyze them. It does not prevent coalition building or negotiation. What it does is require that each major proposal receive its own debate and its own vote, so that the record shows clearly where each member stood on each issue. California has a single subject rule. Texas has one. Florida has one. These are not small, simple legislatures dealing with simple problems. They are among the largest and most complex legislative bodies in the world, and they operate under a requirement that Congress has never had to follow. The argument that a single subject rule would prevent Congress from functioning is directly contradicted by the documented experience of 44 states. That is not an opinion. That is the record. Now, would applying such a rule to Congress be politically difficult? Absolutely. Would it require members to take standalone votes on provisions they currently hide inside must-pass packages? Yes. Would it make log rolling harder? It would. And that is exactly the point. The Federalist Papers are primary sources, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay to explain and defend the Constitution they had just drafted. They are not abstract philosophy. They are documented arguments about how American government was designed to work. In Federalist No. 62, Madison wrote about the importance of stability and clarity in legislation, arguing that even the Senate's more deliberative pace served a purpose. because lawmakers who could not understand the laws they were passing could not be expected to execute them effectively, and citizens who could not understand the laws could not hold their representatives accountable for them. In Federalist No. 70, Hamilton argued that clarity and accountability in government are inseparable. When authority is diffused, when responsibility for a decision is spread across many actors in a complex process, no one can be held responsible for the outcome. Accountability requires that a decision be traceable to a decision maker. Apply those two arguments to a 1,000-page omnibus bill in which a single provision, one that a bipartisan coalition explicitly tried to remove, is embedded so deeply that no member of Congress is required to take a recorded vote on it specifically. How does a voter hold their representative accountable for their position on that provision? The answer is they cannot, not meaningfully. The member voted for or against the whole package. Their position on the specific provision is whatever they say it is in a press release, which the document record may or may not support. Hamilton and Madison did not anticipate must-pass omnibus legislation. They could not have. But the principles they articulated, deliberation, clarity, accountability, the ability of citizens to understand what their government is doing and who is responsible for it, are directly violated by a system in which significant policy is routinely embedded in legislation that members cannot fully read, that the public cannot meaningfully evaluate, and that no one can vote against without voting against everything else simultaneously. Here is where I stand, clearly and on the record, because this is the kind of episode where I think my position matters, and you deserve to know what it is. As a paralegal, as an American citizen, as someone who reads bills for a living and then tries to explain them to the people they affect. I believe that every major provision of federal legislation, every provision that creates a new federal program, that alters an existing constitutional authority, that commits American resources or American military capacity, deserves its own debate and its own recorded vote, not because I am naive about how Congress works. I am not. Not because I think compromise is wrong. Compromise is essential to representative government. But because the current system has drifted so far from accountability that a bipartisan pair of House members can try to give their colleagues a standalone vote on a significant provision, and the Rules Committee can simply say no. And that no stands, and the provision passes inside a $115 trillion bill, and no member of Congress is required to state publicly, for the record, what they think of that provision specifically. That is not representation. That is concealment dressed up as efficiency. The practical path does not require a constitutional amendment. The House and Senate each set their own rules at the beginning of every Congress, a rule requiring that any non-germane provision, any provision not directly related to the primary subject of the bill, must receive a separate vote, is within the authority of either chamber to adopt. It has been proposed. It has never passed, because the members who would vote on it are the same members who benefit from the current system. 44 states have shown it can work. The founders argued it was essential. The documents from last week show what happens when it doesn't. The answer is not to burn Congress down. The answer is sunlight. Every major proposal, its own debate, every significant vote, on the record. Every member accountable for what they actually supported, not just what they say they supported in a press release. The documents are in the description. This is Words with Wentz. Know your rights.
Let the signal cut through the noise. Reading between the lines. Every story leaves a trace, unlocking time and space. Find